Imagine taking $72 million and lighting a match, just watching it burn to ash. That isn't a metaphor. That is the life of William Bedford. He was the 7-foot giant chosen to rule the NBA. The man who stood shoulder to shoulder with the legendary Bad Boys of Detroit. He was supposed to be the next Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, but instead of wearing a Hall of Fame ring, he ended up wearing an orange jumpsuit in a federal penitentiary. How does a man with the world at his feet end up facing 10 years behind bars? Was it the pressure? Was it the chemical demons that took his soul? Or was it the terrifying curse of '86? If you think this is a sports summary, turn the channel now. This is a crime scene investigation of a wasted life. Tonight, we open the files the league wanted to bury. We expose the dark secrets of the locker room and the police reports that tell the real story. This is the unauthorized, unfiltered truth about the giant who fell from the stars, straight into the abyss. To understand how a man falls from the stratosphere, you have to understand how he got there in the first place. And for William Bedford, the ascent began in Memphis, Tennessee, in the early '60s. Imagine the atmosphere of the American South in that era. The air was thick with change, with music, with the heat of the Mississippi River. William was born on December 14, 1963. But he did not just grow up like other children. He expanded. He skyrocketed. By the time he hit his teenage years at Melrose High School, he was already a towering figure, a monolith in a world of ordinary people. But here lies the first crack in the foundation. Most legends are forged in fire. They struggle, they fight, they overcome being too short or too slow. William Bedford never had to fight. Nature handed him a winning lottery ticket the moment he took his first breath. When you are 7 feet tall in high school, you do not need to work hard to dominate. You just have to show up. And that is exactly what he did. He showed up. He stood under the basket, raised his arms, and the world applauded. Insiders from his early days tell a disturbing story. They speak of a young man who was intoxicated by his own ease. Why run sprints when you can walk and still block every shot? Why study the playbook when you can just reach over your opponent's head? The coaches, desperate for wins, looked the other way. They saw the height. They saw the soft touch of his hands, which was incredibly rare for a man of his size, and they ignored the laziness. They ignored the fact that he was often the last one to arrive at practice and the first to leave. They created a monster of entitlement. The tragedy of William Bedford began right there, in the hallways of Melrose High. He was taught a dangerous lesson that would follow him for the rest of his life. The rules do not apply to giants. While other kids were learning discipline, William was learning that his natural gifts were a get-out-of-jail-free card. He was the local celebrity, the Prince of Memphis. Girls, popularity, accolades, it all came to him without a drop of sweat. He was building a skyscraper on a foundation of sand, and nobody dared to tell him that the ground was shifting beneath his feet. When it came time for college, William did not have to pack his bags and leave town. He stayed right there in Memphis, joining the Memphis State Tigers. And if high school was a bubble of praise, college was a cauldron of adoration. In the mid-'80s, college basketball was huge, sometimes even bigger than the professional leagues in terms of raw passion. And Bedford, he was the crown jewel. On the court, he was magnificent. Let us give credit where it is due. Watching William Bedford play for Memphis State was like watching a special effect. He was 7 feet tall, but he moved like a forward. He had a jump shot that was pure silk. In 1985, he helped lead the Tigers to the Final Four, the promised land of college basketball. The city of Memphis was at his feet. They worshipped him. He averaged over 17 points a game in his final season. He was a first-team All-American. He was, by all metrics, unstoppable. But while the cameras were focused on his dunks, Something dark was festering in the shadows. The higher he climbed, the darker the shadows became. Being a college star in a basketball-crazed city meant access. Access to parties, access to women, and most fatally, access to substances that alter the mind and steal the soul. Rumors began to swirl around the campus. Whispers that the big man liked the nightlife a little too much. Whispers that he was skipping classes not because he was busy training, but because he was recovering from the night before. But who is going to stop the star player when the team is winning? Who is going to pull the golden goose aside and tell him to clean up his act? Nobody. The boosters, the hangers-on, the friends who appeared out of nowhere, they all wanted a piece of the pie. They enabled him. They handed him the drinks. They handed him the powders. It was during these years at Memphis State that the pattern cemented itself. William realized that no matter what he did on Saturday night, as long as he put the ball in the hoop on Tuesday night, he was untouchable. He was living a double life. By day, the hero of the campus, the future millionaire. By night, a young man drifting further and further into a chemical fog. The scouts from the big leagues started to notice. They saw the glassy eyes. They heard the stories about his lack of motor. They saw a player who would dominate for 5 minutes and then disappear for 10. But talent is a seductive mistress. They looked at his 7-foot frame and thought, we can fix him. We can change him. It was a fatal arrogance that would cost everyone dearly. If there is ever a moment in sports history that feels like it was written by a horror novelist, it is the NBA draft of 1986. Looking back, it wasn't just a selection of players, it was a gathering of doomed souls. It has been called the cursed draft, and for good reason. Before we even get to William Bedford, we have to set the stage, because the air that night was thick with a strange, heavy energy. 2 days after the draft, the second overall pick, Len Bias, a young man who was supposed to rival Michael Jordan, collapsed and left this world forever due to a sudden heart failure induced by the very substances that would haunt this entire class of players. That tragedy should have been a wake-up call. It should have been the moment the party stopped. But for William Bedford, the party was just getting started. The Phoenix Suns, a team desperate for a savior, looked at the board. They saw the chaos, they saw the risks, and they made their choice. With the 6th overall pick, they selected the 7-foot wonder from Memphis State. The logic was intoxicatingly simple. You cannot teach height. You cannot teach the kind of soft, feathery shooting touch that Bedford possessed. In the war rooms of the NBA, potential is a powerful narcotic, and the Suns were addicted to the idea of what Bedford could become. They ignored the whispers. They ignored the fact that his motor ran cold more often than it ran hot. They handed him a jersey and a contract that would make your head spin. But let's pause and look at the irony. Here was a young man entering a league that was about to be shaken to its core by the dangers of recreational habits. And yet, he was walking straight into the fire. The experts on television smiled and talked about his wingspan, about his ability to run the floor. They projected him as an all-star, a franchise cornerstone. But behind the smiles and the firm handshakes, the clock was already ticking. The 1986 draft class would go down in history, not for its championships, but for its wasted lives and broken dreams. And William Bedford was right at the center of that tragic photo, smiling a smile that hid 1,000 secrets. The move to Phoenix was supposed to be a fresh start. The desert sun, the open space, the professional environment. But for a young man with a pocket full of newfound millions and a lack of self-discipline, Phoenix was not a sanctuary. It was a playground without a fence. Suddenly, William Bedford had access to a lifestyle that most of us only see in movies. And let's be honest, when you give a 22-year-old unchecked wealth and fame, You are handing him a loaded weapon. The structure of college was gone. There were no dorm mothers, no strict curfew checks. There was only the game and the long, empty hours between them. It didn't take long for the cracks to turn into canyons. The white demon that had flirted with him in Memphis moved in as a permanent roommate in Arizona. We are talking about a chemical dependency that changes the brain's chemistry, making the highs of the basketball court feel dull compared to the highs of the night. His performance on the court became erratic. One night he would look like the future of the franchise, scoring with ease, blocking shots into the third row. The next night, he would be a ghost, lethargic, slow, confused. His eyes would look heavy, his reactions delayed by a fraction of a second, an eternity in professional sports. The Phoenix Suns front office panicked. Usually when a team drafts a player in the top 10, they protect him. They nurture him for years. They hide his flaws, but the situation with Bedford was so volatile, so undeniable, that they hit the eject button in record time. Think about that. They saw something so terrifying in his behavior, so destructive in his lifestyle, that they decided to cut their losses after a single season. They traded him away for pennies on the dollar. It was a fire sale of a human being. It was a massive red flag waving in the wind, screaming to the rest of the league, "This man is dangerous to your locker room." But as we know, in the world of professional sports, arrogance often deafens the ears of caution. Enter the Detroit Pistons. In the late 80s, they weren't just a basketball team. They were a gang in shorts. They were the bad boys. Isaiah Thomas, Bill Laimbeer, Rick Mahorn, Dennis Rodman. These men were warriors who prided themselves on physical intimidation, psychological warfare, and a work ethic that would break a normal person. They were the villains of the NBA, and they loved it. When the Pistons management saw Bedford available on the trade market, they didn't see a problem. They saw a project. They thought their culture was strong enough to fix him. It was a classic case of hubris. They believed that if they threw this soft, talented giant into a pit of wolves, he would either learn to howl or be eaten. They were betting on the former. The plan was seductive in its simplicity. They needed a backup center, someone to relieve the bruising Bill Laimbeer. They needed fresh legs, height, and scoring. Bedford had all of that in abundance. Imagine the scene: William Bedford, a man who preferred the easy route, walking into the most intense, hostile practice facility in America. He was suddenly surrounded by men who would elbow their own mothers for a rebound. The culture shock must have been paralyzed. The Pistons veterans looked at him with skepticism. They smelled weakness. They knew the rumors, but they also knew that if he could just get his act together, they would be invincible. But there was a fatal flaw in this plan. Detroit, the Motor City, was not a monastery. It was a hard-living, hard-partying town. If Phoenix offered temptations, Detroit offered an entire buffet of vices for a man with money and a weakness for the nightlife. The bad boys played hard, but many of them lived hard too. Bedford wasn't walking into a rehabilitation center. He was walking into a high-pressure cooker where the stress was immense, and the release valves were often found in the shadowy backrooms of exclusive clubs. He was supposed to be the final piece of a championship puzzle. Instead, he became a ticking time bomb hidden in the heart of a championship machine. The deal with the devil was signed, and the collection date was approaching faster than anyone realized. When William Bedford arrived in Detroit, he wasn't just joining a basketball team, he was walking into a military unit. The Bad Boys Pistons were famous for their psychological toughness, their grueling practices, and their us-against-the-world mentality. But while veterans like Bill Laimbeer and Rick Mahorn were sharpening their elbows and studying game tapes, Bedford was playing a dangerous game of hide-and-seek. Imagine the scene: a locker room filled with the most intense competitors in the world, men who could smell fear and weakness like sharks smell blood. And right there in the middle of them sat a 7-foot enigma, a man who was physically gifted beyond belief, but mentally drifting in a chemical fog. Bedford's first season in Detroit was a masterclass in deception. To the fans in the stands at the Pontiac Silverdome, he was the terrifying backup center, a giant who could come off the bench and score with a soft touch that seemed impossible for his size. He showed flashes of absolute brilliance. There were nights when he looked like the missing link, the weapon that made the Pistons invincible. The coaching staff, led by the legendary Chuck Daly, the Daddy Rich of coaching, desperately wanted to believe the gamble had paid off. They saw the potential. They saw a young man who could dominate the league for a decade if he could just stay focused. But behind the scenes, the reality was a ticking time bomb. While his teammates were recovering with ice baths and massages, Bedford was disappearing into the Detroit night. He was living a double life that would have crushed a lesser man. The demons he brought with him from Phoenix didn't vanish in the cold Michigan winter. They thrived. He was walking a tightrope over a canyon of addiction, balancing the grueling demands of an NBA season with a lifestyle that was slowly eating him alive from the inside out. He was late to meetings. His eyes often had that telltale glassy look that seasoned veterans recognized but didn't want to acknowledge. The locker room was a powder keg, and Bedford was playing with matches, convinced that his talent was a fireproof suit that would protect him forever. Then came the glory. The Detroit Pistons reached the mountaintop. They battled through the grueling Eastern Conference, they toppled the mighty giants of the league, and they claimed the NBA championship. Confetti rained down from the rafters. Champagne flowed like water in the locker room. And there, amidst the hugging and the tears of joy, stood William Bedford. He was an NBA champion. He had the hat, the t-shirt, and soon he would have the heavy gold ring encrusted with diamonds. It is the moment every child dreams of when they first pick up a basketball. But for Bedford, this triumph had a strange, hollow ringing sound to it. Let's look closely at that picture. You have Isaiah Thomas playing on a severely sprained ankle, giving his heart and soul. You have Joe Dumars playing through personal tragedy. You have men who sacrifice their bodies and minds for that trophy. And then you have Bedford. Did he contribute? Yes, in spurts. But deep down, in the quiet moments when the cheering stopped, he must have known he was a passenger on a train driven by others. He was a tourist in the land of greatness. The bad boys won because of their grit, their brotherhood, and their discipline, everything Bedford was struggling to find within himself. This championship ring became a symbol of the great paradox of his life. On the surface, he was a winner. He was rich, famous, and holding the ultimate prize. But internally, the rot was spreading. Success is a dangerous thing for a man with secrets. It validates bad behavior. It whispers in your ear, "See? You can party all night, ignore the rules, and still be a champion." Instead of a wake-up call, the title was an anesthetic. It numbed him to the reality that he was wasting his gift. He had reached the peak of the mountain, but he hadn't climbed it. He had been carried. And the higher you are carried, the farther you have to fall. The bubble finally burst with a deafening pop. The NBA, which had long turned a blind eye to the recreational habits of its stars in the 70s, was changing. A new era of scrutiny was dawning, and William Bedford was caught in the spotlight. The league announced a suspension. It wasn't just a slap on the wrist, it was a sledgehammer. He would miss an entire season. For the average fan, it was a shock, a sudden disappearance of a key role player. But for those in the inner circle, it was the inevitable crash of a train that had been off the rails for years. Think about the psychological devastation of that year. Bedford was a young millionaire with no job to go to, no practice to attend, and no teammates to keep him in check. The structure of his life vanished overnight. He was banned from the very thing that gave him purpose. And what does a man with an addiction do when he has infinite free time and a bruised ego? He dives deeper. That lost season wasn't a time of reflection and rehabilitation. It was a descent into the abyss. While his teammates were out there defending their title, fighting tooth and nail to keep the crown, Bedford was sitting at home, watching them on television, a ghost in his own life. The brotherhood of the Pistons, usually so tight-knit, began to close ranks. In professional sports, you are only as good as your availability. A player who cannot take the court is a liability. A player who gets suspended for substance abuse is a distraction. The phone calls from teammates became less frequent. The invitations stopped coming. He was exiled to an island of his own making. The thunder out of a clear sky wasn't just the suspension. It was the realization that the world keeps spinning without you. The league moved on, the games were played, the highlights were shown. And William Bedford, the man with the golden touch, was slowly being erased from the picture, replaced by a darker, sadder version of himself that no amount of money could fix. When William Bedford returned to the NBA after his year in exile, the script was written perfectly. It was supposed to be the classic American redemption story. The cameras were there, the microphones were shoved in his face, and he said all the right things. He looked into the lens with those big, sad eyes and swore that the demons were behind him. He spoke about maturity, about realizing what he had almost lost, about doing it for his family and his teammates. The fans, bless their hearts, wanted to believe him. We always want to believe in the comeback. We want to believe that a man can stare into the abyss and climb back out unchanged. But anyone who has dealt with the grip of dependency knows the terrible truth. The man who climbs out is never the same as the man who fell in. The reality on the court was heartbreaking. The William Bedford who returned was a shadow. The explosive leap, that defiance of gravity that made him a lottery pick, was gone. In its place was a heaviness, a lethargy that no amount of training camp could shake off. You could see it in his movement. He was a step slow on defense. He was hesitant on offense. The Bad Boys were a team built on precision and ferocity. And suddenly, they had a rusty cog in the machine. But the most terrifying part wasn't his physical decline, it was the deception. Psychologists tell us that those battling severe habits become the world's greatest actors. Bedford became a master of the masquerade. He learned how to pass the tests, how to say the specific phrases coaches wanted to hear, all while the shadow was still whispering in his ear, waiting for the lights to go out. The coaching staff watched him like hawks, but even they were fooled by the illusion of compliance. He showed up on time, mostly. He stayed out of the police blotter, for now. But the spark was extinguished. The fire that separates the good from the great had been smothered by a chemical blanket. He was collecting a paycheck, occupying a roster spot, and playing a role. But inside? Inside, the war was still raging, and he was losing territory every single day. The redemption was nothing more than a fresh coat of paint on a house that was rotting from the foundation up. The end of a career often doesn't come with a bang, but with a whimper. For William Bedford, the end in Detroit was a cold, calculated business decision. The Pistons, tired of the drama, tired of the uncertainty, finally cut the cord. They traded him to the Los Angeles Clippers, and then he bounced to the San Antonio Spurs. Think about that trajectory. He went from the champions, the toughest team in the world, to wandering the league like a nomad. By the time he landed in San Antonio in 1993, the writing was on the wall in neon letters. The Spurs are known for their discipline, their military-like culture. If Detroit couldn't fix him, San Antonio certainly wasn't going to tolerate him. He played a handful of games. The statistics are pathetic. A few points here, a rebound there. But the real story isn't in the box score. It's in what didn't happen. At 29 years old, the absolute prime for a center, the age when a man should be dominating the paint and securing his legacy, William Bedford was washed up. He was done. The league, which is a cruel and efficient beast, simply chewed him up and spit him out. There is a terrifying finality to the day an athlete is told, "We don't need you anymore." For a normal person, losing a job is hard. For a man who has been treated like a god since he was 15, it is a death sentence for the ego. The phone stopped ringing. The agents moved on to the next young giant. The entourage, sensing the money train had derailed, vanished into the night. William Bedford was left standing in the wreckage of a career that should have lasted another decade. He had millions in career earnings, yes, but he also had a lifestyle that burned cash like fuel, and a habit that was hungrier than any tax collector. The doors of the NBA slammed shut, and he was left on the outside, looking in, with nothing but his demons to keep him company. Then came the silence. The 90s rolled on. Jordan returned. The Bulls dominated. The game evolved. And William Bedford? He became a ghost. For almost 10 years, he vanished from the public eye. This is the lost decade. And in the world of a high-profile addict, silence is rarely a sign of peace. Silence usually means the descent has gone underground. We can only piece together fragments of this time. It is a period of shadows. Without the structure of the NBA season, without the mandatory practices and the team flights, Bedford was untethered. The millions began to evaporate. High-end condos were replaced by modest apartments, then by rented rooms. The circle of friends shifted from all-stars and celebrities to people who operated in the twilight, dealers, hustlers, people who didn't care about his jump shot, only about his ability to pay. Rumors would surface occasionally in Memphis. Someone would see a tall man who looked vaguely familiar, wandering the streets, looking disheveled. Was that the guy who played for the Pistons? No, couldn't be. That guy was a millionaire. This guy looks like he's carrying the weight of the world. He drifted into the gray economy of the streets. The pride that once made him a king on the court now kept him from asking for help. He was trapped in a spiral of shame and need. The lost decade wasn't just about losing money, it was about losing his identity. He ceased to be William Bedford, the NBA player, and became just another customer in the grim marketplace of dependency. It was the calm before the storm, the slow, agonizing slide toward the inevitable crash that would finally put his name back in the headlines, for all the wrong reasons. If the 90s were a slow fade into obscurity, the new millennium arrived with the force of a battering ram. The date was simple, the setting mundane, a highway in Michigan, the kind of road you drive down without thinking. But for William Bedford, this strip of asphalt became the graveyard of his freedom. It was a routine traffic stop, police lights flashing in the rearview mirror, a scene that plays out thousands of times a day across America. But the man behind the wheel wasn't just any driver, and the cargo in the trunk wasn't just luggage. When the officers opened the back of the vehicle, they didn't find gym bags or basketballs. They found 25 pounds of green contraband. Let's pause and let that number sink in. 25 pounds. This wasn't a personal stash for a weekend party. This was weight. This was trafficking. This was the moment the world realized that William Bedford wasn't just a user. He had become a mule. He had become a cog in the very machine that had destroyed his career. The former NBA center who once battled Hakeem Olajuwon and Patrick Ewing was now moving product for shadow figures who likely viewed him as nothing more than a disposable asset. But the tragedy didn't stop there. As if one arrest wasn't enough to ring the alarm bells, fate, or perhaps his own self-destruction, struck again just 2 months later. While out on bond, while the legal noose was already tightening around his neck, he was caught again. Another stop. More illicit substances, It was a cry for help so loud it shattered windows. It was the behavior of a man who had completely lost the ability to care about consequences. He was spiraling, free-falling without a parachute, crashing through every safety net that society, the law, and common sense could provide. The headlines were brutal. The bad boy had gone bad in the worst possible way. The hero of Memphis had become a cautionary tale on the evening news. The courtroom is a cruel theater. It strips away the glamour, the lights, and the roaring crowds, leaving only the cold, hard truth. When William Bedford stood before the judge, he looked smaller than he ever had in his life. Gone was the swagger of the first-round pick. Gone was the defiant stare of a champion. In his place stood a 40-year-old man, broken, humiliated, and facing the wreckage of his own choices. The prosecutor didn't care about his jump hook. The judge didn't care about his championship ring. To the law, he was just another statistic in the war on illicit trade. The sentence was a hammer blow, 10 years, 10 years in federal prison. For a man who was used to 5-star hotels and private charters, the prospect of a decade in a cage must have felt like a death sentence. Reports from the courtroom describe a scene of utter devastation. The giant wept. And these weren't the tears of a child caught stealing candy. These were the deep, racking sobs of a man realizing he had thrown away the second half of his life just as recklessly as he had thrown away the first. But here is the twist that makes this story so compelling. In a strange way, that gavel coming down might have been the only thing that saved him. Had he continued on the streets, running product, consuming his own supply, surrounded by predators, he likely would have ended up in a pine box instead of a prison cell. The courtroom was the rock bottom he needed to hit. It was the end of the denial. There were no more agents to bail him out, no more coaches to cover for him, just concrete walls, steel bars, and a number on a uniform that replaced the name on his jersey. Welcome to the Federal Correctional Institution. This is not the NBA. There are no timeouts here. William Bedford entered the system as inmate number, a celebrity in a world where fame can get you killed or make you a target for extortion. Imagine walking into the prison yard standing 7 feet tall. You cannot hide. You cannot blend in. Every eye is on you. The inmates know who you are. They know you had millions. They know you played with Isaiah. And now you are wearing the same cheap fabric, eating the same tasteless food, and sleeping on the same thin mattress as them. But prison is a strange teacher. It strips you of your ego. For the first time in his life, William Bedford was forced to live without the crutch of substances. The fog finally lifted. He had to face his demon sober, day after agonizing day. He worked in the prison kitchen, scrubbing pots, serving food, a humbling reality for hands that once signed million-dollar contracts. He became a coach of sorts, not in a stadium, but on the cracked asphalt of the prison yard, teaching young men, who had also made terrible mistakes, how to shoot, how to move, and perhaps how to think. Stories from inside the walls paint a picture of a man undergoing a slow, painful metamorphosis. He wasn't the star anymore. He was the elder statesman of failures. He began to mentor younger inmates, sharing the brutal wisdom of his own collapse. "Don't be like me," became his mantra. The prison became his university, a place where he finally learned the discipline that had eluded him at Memphis State and in Detroit. He served his time not with bitterness, but with a growing sense of clarity. The bad boy was dying, and a repentant man was being born in the crucible of confinement. It was a long, hard road, but for the first time, he was walking it with his eyes open. The year is 2011. The heavy steel gates of the federal penitentiary swing open, and William Bedford steps out into the sunlight. But the world he enters is not the one he left. Think about it. He went away in 2001, before smartphones were in every pocket, before social media dominated our lives, before the world accelerated into the digital age. He walked out like a time traveler, blinking in the harsh light of a future he didn't recognize. He was 47 years old. His body, once a marvel of athletic engineering, was now stiff and aging. His bank account, which once held the GDP of a small island nation, was effectively zero. Reintegration is a brutal process. In prison, you are institutionalized. You are told when to eat, when to sleep, when to stand. Suddenly, you are free, and that freedom is terrifying. Where do you go? Who do you call? Most of the friends from the high-flying days were long gone, vanished like smoke when the money ran out. The hangers-on, the dealers, the people who laughed at his jokes when he was buying the rounds, they were nowhere to be found. He was left with the wreckage of his personal life. Bridges had been burned, trust had been incinerated. He had to face his children, now grown, and try to explain where he had been, not just for the 10 years in prison, but for the years before that when he was lost in the fog. Finding a job is hard enough for the average person. Now imagine trying to find work when your resume says NBA Center, followed by a 10-year gap labeled federal inmate. The stigma is a heavy coat that you can never quite take off. He wasn't William Bedford the star anymore. He was William Bedford, the ex-con. The humility required to start over from scratch, to ask for help, to navigate a world that had written him off, is perhaps the greatest challenge he ever faced. It wasn't about blocking a shot anymore. It was about finding a reason to get out of bed when the cheering had stopped forever. It was only after his release that we truly heard the voice of the man inside the monster. William Bedford sat down for interviews, and for the first time, the bravado was gone. The defensive walls were down. What we got was a confession so raw it made your heart ache. He didn't blame the coaches. He didn't blame the bad boys culture. He looked straight into the camera and pointed the finger at himself. He spoke about the demon of dependency, not as a party habit, but as a predator that stalked him. He admitted that he had blown through $7, maybe $8 million. Just gone, up in smoke, down the drain, into the pockets of people who didn't care if he lived or passed away. He described the sensation of being high as a way to escape the pressure, but admitted that it became a prison long before he was ever locked up. "I had the world in my hands," he said in one particularly haunting moment, "and I just let it slip through my fingers." He talked about the regret of watching his peers, men he used to dominate, go on to Hall of Fame careers, become broadcasters, become businessmen, while he was sitting in a cell, wondering if anyone remembered his name. This wasn't a pity party. It was a warning. He spoke with the clarity of a survivor who has walked through fire and has the scars to prove it. He talked about the pain of disappointing his mother, the only person who had stood by him through the chaos. He talked about the shame of seeing his mugshot on the news. These interviews weren't just sound bites, they were the autopsy of a wasted talent. He stripped himself bare, allowing the world to see the ugly truth of what happens when you let the nightlife become your only life. It was a confession of a fallen angel who finally understood that his wings weren't clipped by others. He had cut them off himself. So where does a giant go when the bright lights are turned off? He goes back to the beginning. William Bedford returned to Memphis. But he didn't return to a mansion on the hill. He returned to a modest life, a life of a mortal. He began working with kids. He started coaching at local gyms, running camps for the youth. And this is where the story takes a turn toward redemption. He didn't try to be the star. He used his life as a cautionary tale. He would look these young kids in the eye, kids who dreamed of the NBA, kids who wanted the cars and the jewelry, and he would tell them the truth. "Don't be like me," he would say. "Be better than me." There is a profound dignity in his later years. He isn't rich. He drives a regular car. He shops at the regular grocery store. If you saw him, You might just think he's a very tall man with a bad back, maybe a former construction worker. You wouldn't know that he once stood at center court in the Pontiac Silverdome with 20,000 people screaming his name. But in many ways, this quiet life is his greatest victory. He is clean. He is free. He is contributing. He works with the Memphis Roar program, helping young players develop their skills, but more importantly, their character. He teaches them that talent is nothing without discipline. He is paying his debt to society not with money, but with wisdom. The tragedy of William Bedford is still there. The what if will always hang over him. But the man himself has found a way to make peace with the ghost of his potential. He is no longer the next Kareem. He is just William. And after everything he has been through, maybe that is enough. Now we must ask the question that makes the executives in high towers uncomfortable. We have spent an hour talking about William Bedford's mistakes. But was he the only one at fault? Or was he a casualty of a machine that was designed to chew people up? Let's look at the NBA in the mid-'80s. It was a different universe. This was the Wild West era of professional sports. We know now that substances were rampant, not just in the back alleys, but in the locker rooms, on the team planes, in the very hotels where the team stayed. Conspiracy theorists and cynical insiders have long whispered that the league knew exactly what was happening with Bedford and many others long before the suspensions were handed down. Think about it. These teams have doctors, trainers, and security personnel who watch the players 24 hours a day. Is it possible that a 7-foot man could develop a severe dependency without anyone noticing? Or is it more likely that as long as he was putting up numbers, as long as the turnstiles were spinning and the tickets were selling, the powers that be chose to look the other way? There is a dark theory that players like Bedford were viewed as disposable batteries. Use them until the energy runs out, then toss them in the trash and grab a fresh one from the draft. When Bedford was helping the Pistons win, he was our guy. When he became a liability, he was suddenly a pariah. The medical support for mental health and addiction in the 80s was virtually non-existent compared to today. If William Bedford had played in 2024, would he have been suspended for life? Or would he have been placed in a comprehensive wellness program? We will never know. But the silence of the league during his slow, agonizing descent speaks volumes. It suggests that in the high-stakes game of billion-dollar sports, a human life is sometimes just a line item on a spreadsheet, easily erased when the math no longer adds up. What is left when the cheering stops and the arena lights go dark? For most players, legacy is measured in banners, trophies, and Hall of Fame speeches. For William Bedford, the legacy is a shadow. He is the ghost of the 1986 draft. His name has become an adjective in the scouting reports of the NBA. When scouts see a player with immense talent but a questionable motor, they whisper, "Is this another Bedford?" He has become the ultimate cautionary tale, a spooky campfire story that agents tell their young clients to scare them straight. But let's be fair. His legacy is also one of the greatest what-ifs in the history of the game. When you look at the centers who dominated that era, Hakeem Olajuwon, Patrick Ewing, David Robinson, you have to realize that physically, Bedford belonged in that conversation. He had the tools to be a top 50 player of all time. He had the touch of a guard and the size of a monument. The tragedy isn't just that he failed. The tragedy is that we were robbed of seeing greatness. The fans were robbed. The game of basketball was robbed. His statistics, the few points, the modest rebounds, are a lie. They don't show the flashes of brilliance that made jaw drops. They don't show the fluidity that was almost unnatural for a man of his size. His legacy is a monument to wasted potential. It stands as a stark reminder that talent is the cheapest commodity on earth. Discipline, character, and mental fortitude, those are the rare jewels. William Bedford had the winning lottery ticket in his pocket, and he let the wind blow it away. That is a heavy burden to carry into history, and so we come to the end of our journey. We have traveled from the high school gymnasiums of Memphis to the gleaming courts of the NBA, from the depths of addiction to the cold steel of a prison cell, and finally to the quiet redemption of a humble life. Why does this story fascinate us? Why do we stare at the wreckage? Because William Bedford is a mirror. When we look at him, we don't just see a basketball player. We see the fragility of the human condition. We see how close we all are to the edge. How many of us, given millions of dollars and unchecked freedom at 22, would have made the right choices? How many of us have our own demons that we are barely keeping in a cage? Bedford's story is not just about sports. It is a Greek tragedy played out on hardwood. It is about Icarus flying too close to the sun, melting his wings, and falling into the sea. Today, William Bedford walks among us, a mortal man. He is no longer the giant who could touch the sky. He is a man who has paid a price higher than any of us can imagine. He has lost his fortune, his fame, and his prime years. But he has gained something perhaps more valuable, the truth. He knows who he is. He knows what he survived. As you turn off your screen tonight, I want you to think about that image of the empty jersey. The number hangs in the rafters of our imagination, a symbol of what could have been. The roar of the crowd has faded into a ghostly whisper. The money is gone, the glory is dust. But the man remains. And in the end, perhaps the greatest victory of William Bedford's life wasn't a championship ring. It was simply surviving the fall.